Thanks, Mary. It is incredible to be up here. Well, my script says incredible. I feel like surreal is probably a slightly better term to use. As Mary noted, I've been at Yelp for almost a decade now across all aspects of engineering. If you're not familiar with us, we are a platform for connecting people with great local businesses. And I'm currently responsible for our marketing platform, our advertising product for local businesses, and our guest manager restaurant SaaS product. I've been with the company in San Francisco Bay Area, in Hamburg, Germany, and now in Washington, D.C., as we have gone fully distributed. If you have questions about company, about me, feel free to find me after the talk. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the core question here. What's your exit plan? This is a question that I have asked my reports for years. All too often, people like to pretend that we live in a world where someone is going to join a company and stay forever. If that world ever existed, it certainly doesn't today. Average tenure in the tech industry is less than 3 years. And while I'm sure the current macro environment is going to be lengthening that a little bit, almost no one stays in one place for decades and then retires. What you need will almost always diverge from what your company is able to provide. So let's be honest about that. What's your exit plan? That is, when you quit, and you will quit, why will you quit? This is important for me as a manager to know, because a lot of those reasons can actually be mitigated. If the thing that normally makes you move on from a job is getting bored, let's surface that early so that we can get you onto a different platform or a different team. If the thing that normally makes you leave is quitting spontaneously due to burnout, well, let's keep an eye on your stress levels and make sure that it doesn't get close to that red line. If it's a lack of career advancement, we need to do everything that we can so that you feel like you're growing and gaining responsibilities. If the reason why you're going to quit is someone throwing giant buckets of money your way, well, there's only so much that I can really do to compete with that. But it's still important for me to know so that you and I can work together to make sure that you have the skills and experience necessary to be a target for those giant buckets of money in the future. And then, once we're on the same page with the reasons why you might quit, it becomes that much easier to talk about them and mitigate them when they start to arise. This topic was offered up to me on a silver platter early on in my management career at Yelp. When I first started managing here, an engineer on the team told me outright that they were only going to be around for another year or so, because what they really wanted was to go to a small startup, less than 30 people in total, and build something from scratch. Now, there are a lot of things that we have to offer. That's not really one of them. I thanked them for telling me, and I said that we should keep an eye on this, because at a company that size, they were going to need to wear a lot of different hats. So we should be focusing on the breadth of their experience. Life went on for a couple months, and we had a reorg coming down the line. This engineer was phenomenal, and we thought that they would make a really good anchor for a new team that we were forming. So I went to them and I said, hey, so we're really interested in moving you to this new team as kind of a founding member, but I don't know what your plans are in terms of eventually leaving. If you're going to be here for another year or so, then awesome, let's do this. But if you're eyeing the exit in the next couple of months, it probably doesn't make sense for either one of us because of the transition costs. They thanked me and said they would think about it. The next week in our one-on-one, they came to me and said that while they appreciated the consideration, it probably didn't make sense right now. Because while they weren't actually interviewing yet, this conversation made them realize that they should start. A couple months later, they were gone. People have different reactions to this story when I tell it. Some just can't believe the guts of the engineer. Some think I am an idiot for reminding them of the fact that they were thinking about leaving. Some think it's a heartwarming story of openness and trust. Personally, I look at it as one of the most successful moments of my early management career here. I am pretty sure that we lost this engineer 3-ish months earlier than we would have otherwise. But I couldn't be happier with the outcome. Because let's look at the alternatives. The all smiles and sunshine, perfect world on a perfect day outcome is that we move them to this new team. They love it. They stay there for the next 40 years and retire. But come on, life isn't like this. The more realistic outcomes are they join the new team for a while. If they love it, maybe they stick around for a quarter or two longer than they had originally planned. If they hate it, maybe they bounce early, throwing the team into chaos. Instead, by having this conversation, we were able to move forward with the reorg with people that we knew were interested in actually seeing it through. This engineer felt heard and supported, and we avoided any potential thrashing. My more realistic outcomes aren't just conjecture either, because this was a big reorg, and it turns out that we had another person that we were planning on moving into a similar role on a different team, who was halfway out the door and hadn't told anyone. They gave notice before anything was announced. We panicked a little bit and tried to sell them on the new opportunities that we saw on this new team, but they already had a signed offer elsewhere. We were left scrambling, and they left feeling kind of crappy. 1, because they put us in a bad spot, and 2, because maybe they actually missed a good opportunity. These situations imprinted on me pretty hard early on in my management career here. And so I started being really explicit with the team, asking this question about exit plans. I've always had confidence in the personal relationships that I have with the people on the team, and so I trusted my ability to have this frank conversation with the people that reported to me. If you want a more in-the-weeds rundown of how I handle these one-on-one conversations, I've written a companion piece on the LeadDev site, which you can find at the QR code on the screen. I actually debated making that the focus of this entire talk. But with like so many things in our industry, the really interesting question is, how do you scale it up? As I stepped into second and third and fourth level manager roles, and my overall scope grew, I was still having these same conversations with my reports. I was trusting the managers on my teams to have these conversations. But over time, it became clear that this is a topic that benefits from broader institutional support and some more direct messaging. And so a few years ago, I started trying to figure out how to properly broadcast that exit plans are an okay thing to talk about. Much like how the original idea was handed to me, this realization was also handed to me. Unfortunately, this one less on a silver platter and more like a thwack to the side of the head. It was an unpleasant surprise, one that I'm sure all of the managers in here have gone through or will go through. We had a key employee give a surprise 2 weeks' notice. I felt like this person and I had a pretty strong relationship despite it being skip level, and so I went to them and I asked why we hadn't actually talked about this before now. We had a good discussion, and it boiled down to the fact that they didn't really know what they were doing when it came to quitting a job. As managers, we get a lot more experience in this because people will quit our company or quit our team far more often than we will leave a team or any individual will leave a team. Because think about it, even someone who job hops a lot in their career is going to do it at most, what, a dozen times? While people in my group had been having some of these conversations for years, it was always individual. It was always one-off. There wasn't a known process or common language. And I'm not sure that anyone having these discussions realized that other people were having them too, or that there was broad support for it. That had to change. I knew that broadcasting this message, that exit plans are an okay thing to talk about, was the right thing to do and would be beneficial for everyone involved, but I also could envision it going very poorly. And so before I really dove into the details of the plan, I went to both my VP and my SVP just to make sure that they were okay with the idea. They were both generally supportive, but the overall sentiment could be summed up as, just make sure you think about all the possible consequences. On the plus side, defining my goals for it was actually pretty easy, because it's identical to why I wanted to have these conversations one-on-one in the first place. One, I wanted people to know that they still had options here. Two, I wanted to support people even when they were on the way out the door. And three, selfishly, I didn't want to be surprised. The same thing holds true for the broadcast message. But I'm no longer saying you can talk to me about this in a small room behind closed doors. Instead, what I'm saying is that this is an okay thing to talk about, period. And the generalization of that statement is a little scary. Because what if they don't have a trusting relationship with their manager? What if this spreads outside my org and my peers aren't exactly on board with the idea? What if this opens the doors wide and the idea of quitting spreads like contagion through the group? What if I'm not connected enough to these people for them to trust me? And this gets read as a way to ferret out anyone who isn't sufficiently committed. I talked through all of this with my leadership team, and I got the sign-off to move forward with a presentation for my group. I had had these conversations one-on-one behind closed doors, and it was always a back-and-forth situation where I could read the individual, could respond to questions, answer any concerns that they had. Turning this into a talk meant making it more concrete. And I wasn't naive enough to think that anyone would be asking questions publicly afterwards. And so I had to try to plan in advance for the questions that I thought people were going to have. Also, considering the inspiration for the talk was someone who had left, I had to make sure that nobody thought that I was saying that they had done anything wrong. I talked with them about using our conversation as the impetus for the talk, and they were totally fine with it. But come on, it's really easy for this sort of thing to come off in that time as, don't do what they did. So, with that in mind, I went through my management history to try and find people that had had these conversations with me, or with their managers if I was a skip level. And I started with the two that I already told. And then I built up a handful more. Wherever possible, I reached out to these people, explained what I was doing, got their support, wrote up my version of events, and had them proofread it to make sure that my memory lined up with their lived experiences. I got a really positive response from everybody that I was actually able to contact, and so this formed the foundation of my argument. Other people have done this, and it's been good, to the point where I could reach out to them and still get their support. That person from the first story, I was their manager for all of about 6 months. 4 years later, I was able to reach out, get their buy-in on my telling of the story, and we ended up having a great conversation about where their career has taken them. I also use myself as an example. These are conversations that I have had with my managers, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that. In fact, the second year that I was giving the talk, my org had just changed departments, and my new VP asked me, so how much time do you think you have in this role? It was a great question, given the circumstances. Led to a really productive conversation, and immediately found its way onto my examples pile. I also wanted to make sure that I was addressing any career growth concerns. There's this natural fear that if we know that you're interested in leaving, even if it's not in the short term, maybe we stop giving you interesting work. Maybe we save some money by lowballing your raise. Maybe we pass you up for a promotion. Thankfully, I have plenty of cases from my own history that refute this fact, but I knew that I needed to reinforce that message as much as possible. It helps that I've been at Yelp for almost 9 years, and in that time, I've had more than a few of these conversations myself regarding my plans, and my career's kept growing. These examples form the bulk of the talk, wrapped in what I hope was a compelling introduction and an empathetic conclusion. And after having my direct team give their feedback, All that was left was to cast it out into the world. And immediately afterwards, I felt good. It's that catharsis of having a hard but important thing behind you. That lasted for about 15 minutes before I had 3 people independently schedule time with me, all skip level reports. That is the moment when the fear really kicked in. And I wondered what sort of Pandora's box I had just opened up. All 3 of these people had slightly different topics. The first 2 were the easiest. One, really new engineer, just wanted to say thanks, like the engineering culture, good job. One, wanted to talk generally about their future career and where there may or may not be opportunities. And then we get to person 3. They opened up by saying, so this is really timely because I've been trying to figure out how to talk about the fact that I think this is my last year here. The fact that this person was leaving was a huge bummer. It was a person with a ton of context and skill in a technical leadership position. And so we spent some time talking through sort of what they were looking for. They said they didn't expect to leave in the next few weeks, but that they almost certainly wouldn't be here 6 months from now. Despite their departure being incredibly disappointing, this interaction is exactly what I had hoped for. The talk worked. I gave my first version of this in December of 2019. At the end of 2020, I did a look back on the results. I had expected a lot of attrition across the year because my group at that time was entirely focused on restaurants. And if you remember, 2020 was not a good year for the restaurant industry. Confidence was low. I had 7 people leave my org over the course of that year. Fall into 3 buckets. First bucket, standard 2-week notice. We had exactly 1 person. Second bucket were people who gave us extended notices and helped work through the transition. And we had 3 people there. Third bucket were people who, and there were 3 there, if didn't want to do the math. There were people who actually talked to their managers early on, and we supported them through the process of deciding to leave, interviewing, and getting another job. But that's just the people who left. In addition, there were more than a few people who talked to their managers early on in the stages of their exit plans, and then they stuck around. And this wasn't because we had to do some sort of last-minute save, but because we avoided getting to that point. And since then, I've given this talk to my group on roughly a yearly basis, and the results have been great. It's not a static talk, though. Each time I prepare it, I incorporate more examples since the last time I gave it. My goal is to keep the content fresh with people that the team actually knows. So I reach out to those people who have left, ask if I can use them as examples, get their sign-off on my retelling of the story. This lends a lot of credibility to the overall message that this is okay. In addition to making changes to the examples, I also tend to get feedback after I give it. Sometimes it's like the first time where I get just some really positive thank you feedback, which is nice. Sometimes it's far more critical. Most of the time that critical feedback is constructive. Every now and then there's also some rumor mongering on blind, but that's fine. The most meaningful feedback I've gotten over the years has largely fallen into 3 buckets. First, you make this sound too easy. Second, you are way too demanding. And third, you are not considering people who are in their country of residence on a visa. Over the time, I've done my best to try and address these concerns. The first piece of feedback was intriguing, I will say, because I thought I had made it clear that I knew that this was hard, but that I thought it was still valuable. The first person who brought it up actually framed it as, I'm sure this is easy for you. You've got a lot of experience and confidence, which was a moment for me because this isn't easy for me. This has never been easy for me. But because of that feedback, future iterations have spent more time talking about that. The fact that this is hard, I know this is hard, but we should still do it. As far as demanding too much, that was a clear error in my original version. I never wanted to say that everyone must do this, but hey, I am a person in authority making an ask. People are going to hear that as a demand if I'm not careful. And I was not careful enough. One of the things that I've tried to make clearer and clearer with each successive version is that I do not want people to feel pressured into having these conversations. What I want is for everyone to have an environment where they can have these conversations. And I truly believe, and evidence has shown, that if we can provide that environment, most people will have these conversations. There's always going to be cases where people don't for whatever reason, and that's okay. The only reason that's not okay is that we made you feel like you couldn't have that conversation. The final big piece of feedback was around all the fears that exist for people who are in their country of residence on a work-related visa. I didn't even touch on this in my first version of talk, and that was a glaring oversight. The topic of quitting is hard enough. Add on the fact that maybe you're worried about getting kicked out of the country that you live in, and it enters an impossible realm. So, moving forward, I tried to bring in more examples on that and tried to directly address those specific concerns for people. On top of those specific points, it's also really useful for me to reach out to people who have left. If they did talk to us early about their exit plans, great, just kind of a check-in, see what's going on. If they didn't, I really like to ask what we could have done better to make them more comfortable to talk to us earlier. Each of these conversations is so informationally dense, it's unbelievable, because these are now the lived experiences of people who no longer have anything to fear. Every now and then I'll get someone who is still fairly reserved, but most people just open up. This is a hard topic, and I know that we cannot address every concern or fix every problem, but what we can do is support everyone through the process, regardless of how they leave, and continue to build up the confidence of the people who remain and those who join. When I've talked about this with other engineering leaders outside of Yelp, I have had some mixed reactions. Many people, even those who care a lot about empathetic people management, still feel like this is a bridge too far. That it's important to keep these cards close to your chest, because once you bring up this topic, anything could happen. I expect that some of you in the audience are feeling that right now. And I hear that fear. But I think keeping quiet is just addressing a symptom. Companies will always act in their own best interest. Not yours, not mine. But the thing that I truly believe is that it is in the company's best interest to be open to having these conversations and not penalizing people. It's much cheaper and more efficient to engage and retain your current staff than to always need to go out and hire more and more people. And if a company can't understand that, I have to admit, I'm going to question their judgment in other areas. If I find myself in a position where I cannot talk about my eventual departure, the answer for me isn't to keep quiet about it. The answer is to leave and find a place where I can talk openly about what I need in the long term. I understand what an incredibly privileged statement that is to make, especially in today's world, but this has become a cornerstone of my management philosophy. You can see some companies making progress with the idea of stay interviews, but in my experience, that tends to not be pointed enough to really cut through. Asking, what might make you leave, is a very different framing than, you're going to quit someday. Let's talk about why. The world's a lot different today than when I first started talking about exit plans. Macro environment is the buzzword of the times, whereas in the past it might have been something like blitz scaling. And that is leaving people across the board feeling a whole lot less secure in their jobs. It'd be easy to look at that and say, well, obviously people aren't going to talk about this until they have a signed offer. But I don't think that has to be the state of things. We're going to see lower voluntary attrition rates for a while, absolutely. But sooner or later, that bottleneck will clear. And when it does, if you haven't had these talks and don't know what the catalyst will be for people to leave your team, you are going to get caught by surprise by a wave of departures. Think back to the early days of COVID. Voluntary attrition dropped basically to zero. And the next stage was an era known as the Great Resignation. Having these discussions is just as necessary and possible today, but you do need an even stronger foundation of trust. I touched on it a bit earlier when discussing some of the failure states, but the reality is that in the wrong environment, this can backfire spectacularly. In the best failure states, people just don't believe you, and so they move on as before. In the worst, they think you're trying to root out anyone who isn't sufficiently committed. And today, they might even read that as a way to add names to a list for layoffs. However, I have a large amount of faith that for the people in this audience, a high-trust environment is the baseline. And if it wasn't the baseline before today, hopefully it is now, before today and yesterday. Look to Nick's talk about generative management. Look to Kat's talk about developer productivity, to Lisa's talk about compassionate and sustainable on-call, to Winna's talk about cultural postmortems. Trust is the undercurrent for all of these things. And exit plan conversations in those high-trust environments have been priceless. Regardless of your current role, I would encourage you to explore talking about your exit plans with your manager. If you manage a team, start talking with them about their exit plans in addition to yours. Here again is the QR code for the more process-oriented write-up on the LeadDev site. And if you manage a larger group, well, that's only the starting point. Thank you.